lives and serves in a small town in a fairly rural area. One wintry December day, he was standing outside of his church. He was working on the fire that they were going to use for their solstice ritual. And a woman walked by who was a neighbor. She lived near the church. She wasn't a member or a regular attender there, but she had attended a service for the very first time just the other day, and she wanted to tell him about her experience. When my friend got to this part of the story, I know that the rest of us ministers who were listening kind of girded ourselves for what might come next. Because when a newcomer takes the time to stop you in the street and tell you about their experience at the church, it's either very good or very bad, right? Nobody stops you just to say that they found it kind of interesting and they'll probably give it another try next week. You're either going to hear a great story or a terrible one. It might turn into an inspiring sermon later, or you might feel 1 inch tall at the end of it. Now I've probably made you feel nervous. Well, don't worry, because this story is one of the good ones. The neighbor said that she had tried the church out that day because her sister was visiting from out of town. The sister is a big churchgoer. It was the sister who suggested that they ought to come. My colleague's church is the dominant landmark in the neighborhood in the little town where they are. So the sister encouraged this neighbor. She said, you ought to at least see the inside of it, right? The same sister, it turns out, is politically and religiously conservative, while the neighbor is more liberal. The sister also felt vehemently anti-Muslim, and the two of them had been arguing about it for all of the 2 days that she'd been there. The sister says that Barack Obama secretly got sworn in on a Quran and that kind of thing. Apparently, their breakfast conversation right before church had been particularly heated. That morning, the service consisted of a Hanukkah pageant, so my colleague wasn't preaching. But he did take some extra time in the opening words to touch on the religious and refugee issues of the past week. And at the end, he held up Arabic signs that had become available through our denomination, the Unitarian Universalist Association. He said that they would have these signs around the church building, quote, to remind us of our commitments to the work of love and to be a clear indication of welcome to anyone who might see them and need to know that they were safe with us. A few minutes later, he invited anybody who'd like to come forward to light a candle and say a few words of their own. At this point, the service went off the rails. A little bit. That happens sometimes when you pass the mic in a big group. A couple of people seemed to be in their own little world that morning. But then a young man got up. I'll call him Malik. That's not his real name, but it's similar to it. Malik had been attending off and on for a while, just occasionally. He had been invited by a coworker who was a member of the church. Malik was a Palestinian who grew up in a refugee camp. I mentioned that my colleague had spoken of religious and refugee issues that week. This story took place several years ago, before 2016. With everything that's happened since then, it can be hard to remember now, but the anti-immigrant rhetoric that we're hearing now is not new. It's heightened, and it's coming from the highest offices. I'm talking about things like when the President of the United States calls a wave of asylum seekers an invasion, or when he frames their arrival as diseases coming across the border, instead of humans in need of humanitarian relief, including medical care. Anti-immigrant policies are not new either. They're just increasing now. In that time, several years ago, as now, many immigrants were fearful about their immigration status, and many Muslims in particular were fearful for their safety. My colleague did not know that Malik would be in church when he wrote his opening words and he printed out those signs, but as it turns out, he was there. He was in the front row, and he burst into tears when he saw them. I looked them up online. The signs that are available say things like, "We love our Muslim neighbors." "Peace be upon you," a traditional Arabic greeting. "Be welcome and at ease, beloved friends." and you are safe here. Malik came up and lit his candle intentionally from the Hanukkah menorah. Then he said many loving things about the church and about how he was honored to be allowed to be present for any kind of celebration of Hanukkah, and how he wished that all of the West Bank would close down and shine with Hanukkah candles, lit together by loving Israeli Jews and loving Palestinian Muslims. And he said how good it felt to see the minister holding those signs in Arabic, and how he wished everyone he knew could experience the kind of welcome he felt he had received at their UU church. By then, everybody was in tears. It was an amazing moment. And then the service went on. So back to the solstice fire with the neighbor walking by. She was there with her conservative sister, remember? When they left, her sister said to her, "Well, we have all these arguments, and then we go to church. And what happens there? They celebrate Hanukkah, and the minister talks about welcoming Muslims, and then that man stands up and says what he says. No matter where we go, it seems God finds a way to talk directly to me. I guess I'd better think a bit about this and figure out how to change my mind at least a little." The neighbor could not believe it. It was the first time she said that her sister had ever given an inch on the topic. And she wanted to come by and thank the minister and let him know. Interestingly, she got Malik's name wrong. She said when Muhammad got up to talk. My colleague who experienced this story says, "I'd like to think maybe Muhammad was here talking to her, and Jesus, and Moses, and everyone else too. We never know who's out there in the pews, do we?" There is so much to love in this story. The eclectic combination of solstice, Hanukkah, and Arabic peace messages that make me think only in a UU church, right? The minister, who didn't even preach that day. Well, I'll do my best. The young man invited by a coworker. Too often we neglect to invite others. We're afraid to seem pushy or to seem too religious or to make somebody uncomfortable, but as a consequence, we hide when we could serve. And then there are the two women, so different from each other, but trying to engage in this conversation. The neighbor doesn't seem to have much need for church, but she was willing to try it out for her sister, even though they were already on such different pages from each other. Meanwhile, the sister, who had seemed so rigid, turns out to be open to listening wherever and however God might speak to her. That takes courage. We can all learn from that. Whether or not we believe in God, being open to learning something unexpected or connecting with someone we never imagined connecting with, that's something we can all learn from. Sometimes countering hate is just a matter of existing. It's a way of being. In this story, the church is just kind of doing its thing, and it works. A few weeks ago, I preached about Jesus and immigration, and I quoted Jesus for as long as I think we could all stand. What I mean is that he went on and on and on about caring for people who are poor or sick or oppressed or in need of refuge, and it would take me all day to read it all to you, so eventually I had to just wrap it up. Afterward, one person quipped, "But we agree with you. How do we get this message to everyone else?" I totally understand. Sometimes I wish we could just turn the sanctuary inside out, right, and take this big interfaith mural and just spin it around and park it right on Carlisle Boulevard. Yeah. But this story is a good reminder that it matters what we do inside our sanctuary too, and all throughout our church, in all of the rooms and gatherings we have. You never know who is going to show up or what this place or your words or my words will mean to them or how it will impact us. We're all learning here. I am, and you are. We're teaching our children, and our children are teaching us. Adults are teaching each other. And we are a teaching place for the wider community too, not just for people who attend the church, but for anybody who attends a group or a lecture or a workshop that is hosted here. That's a big deal because that man that shot up El Paso, that mass murderer who said he was responding to an invasion of immigrants, how did he become like that? People taught him. And El Paso also has wonderful coalitions of diverse people working to affirm human life and human dignity. Bob LaValle and I and 18 other UUs drove down and we joined them this week in a march for justice and against white supremacy on Wednesday night. Some people came from a lot farther away than Albuquerque. I talked with one woman who drove 9 hours from Dallas. How did all those people who drummed and sang in the streets with us come to be that way? People taught them. Same with the youth who organized millions of people all around the globe for climate justice this week. So it matters what we do inside our church, being a place that practices peace, that affirms diversity, and teaches. All of that matters. The words and the images we post inside matter as much as the ones that are visible from the street. And it matters that we counter hate outside too. On the streets, in marches, in rallies, in forums, in letters we write, and in conversations, and all of it. But to counter hate, it also matters what happens within our own hearts and minds. And that's where I want to spend some time before we close this morning. When we speak of hate in a context like church, we're usually talking about the big kind, about prejudice, hate toward a whole group, hate that lumps a lot of people together. And it could be for any reason: race, nationality, gender identity, sexual orientation, body type, religion. We can hate based on political party, based on perceived stance on guns, whether or not we understand that stance. We can hate based on how somebody votes on abortion or in an election. Have you ever felt a surge of intense aversion or dislike towards somebody based just on the bumper sticker on their car? Yeah. Or how about on their something on their t-shirt? Right? In late December last year, I was on my way to a class inside the gym where I go. I was lost in thought about my Christmas Eve sermon. And I was thinking also about all the families separated, all those children in jails at Christmas, and not even warm enough and not even fed enough. I was thinking about them when a guy came around the corner wearing a t-shirt with an anti-immigrant slogan on it. I didn't even realize that I was staring at it. I think I probably looked like I was trying to stare it down, actually. I was not at all aware of the look on my face until the guy went, "Ha!" which sounded like a laugh, but to be fair, might have been a nervous response, because I am sure he thought I hated him. The definition of hate is a feeling of intense dislike or aversion, often deriving from fear, anger, or a sense of injury. We develop hate because we are afraid of someone, or maybe afraid of the unknown in them, or because we are angry about something, which may or may not be justified, or because we feel they have wronged us in some way. And in truth, my first instinct, my first reaction when I saw that shirt in that moment was that kind of intense dislike and aversion. I was shocked by the juxtaposition of that shirt and the season and the people in those jails. It's not always wrong to feel aversion or dislike for someone. In fact, it's a necessary survival skill. There are certain people who, because of their behavior, we need to steer clear of. But I did not know that man. I don't know how he came to that perspective, or what he's afraid of or angry about, or whether he's open to God speaking to him in unexpected places. It's said that you can't hate a person once you have stood in their shoes. That's because when we come to understand someone very well, they become complex and human to us. Like us, complex and human like us. We feel empathy for them. You can't hate someone and empathize with them at the same time. In order to hate, we can't stand in their shoes. It takes some distance to hate. Hate requires putting some distance between ourselves and the hated person, writ large, directed toward a whole demographic group and not just to an individual. Hate still depends on some distance. It depends on not really knowing, not really standing in other people's shoes. I think that's why in the story I started with, the woman from out of town was so changed when she heard Malik speak from his heart. She heard his heart through his words. It beat just like hers, felt sadness just like hers could. And suddenly she understood something about being in his shoes. But what if somebody had gotten up before or after Malik and expressed their strong aversion and disgust toward conservatives, and lumped that visitor in with a whole group made up of individuals, each with their own shoes, and shoved some distance in between her and that congregation? Or what if somebody had made a comment like that to her one-on-one or in a small group after the service? The thing about hate is that it has a tendency to feed off of itself and to escalate. The American Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron talks about breaking cycles of aggression, and she talks about the way when we are offended by someone or something, we harden. You can see this happening in somebody's face when they harden in response to you. Like a change just comes over it, right? The energy changes between you. That guy in the gym saw that on my face. But whenever we harden our hearts, Chodron asks, what is going on with us? There's an uneasiness, and then a tightening, and a shutting down. And then the next thing we know, the chain reaction begins, and we become very righteous, she says. We ourselves become fundamentalists, which is to say we become very self-righteous about our personal point of view. She goes on to say that whenever we harden our hearts, it's because we are afraid. From there, it's a short trip to dislike and aversion or hate. We may even begin to use dehumanizing language for the other person, calling them a piece of garbage or worse, things like that. There's a teaching in Buddhism, and this comes via Chodron again. There's a teaching that behind all hardening and tightening and rigidity of the heart, there is always fear. But if you touch the fear, behind the fear there is a soft spot. And if you touch the soft spot, you find the vast blue sky. You find that which is ineffable, ungraspable, and unbiased, that which can support and awaken us at any time. I think this is about the infinite source of compassion, wisdom, and love. It's about that thing that we must draw upon in order to create the reality we long for, a world of kindness and equity where people and other beings thrive, a place that won't be created by hate meeting hate or by hardened people meeting hardened people. I almost called this sermon Confronting Hate, but that sounds like, it reminded me of the hardening that she is describing. It sounded confrontational and not quite the right way. It sounded like hardening against haters when we ourselves are so capable of hating too. And that perpetuates a chain reaction. Fighting Hate was another possible title. But I am weary of battle metaphors. What we want to do is counter it. We want to take its energy and transform it into something else. We want to overwhelm it. We want to outdo it. And we want to do it in such a way as to leave room for those we disagree with, even vehemently, to become our allies. Because there are no enemies in that world that we long for. How do we counter hate on our way to that world? Well, we're clear about what's important to us. We speak the truth. But part of being clear about what's important to us is also keeping the other human. We do not dehumanize those that scare us or make us angry or cause injury. We speak the truth in love as much as we can muster at all times. I try to practice what I preach. I am not more perfect than you. We're learning together, and that's why I tell you these stories. But I do know that what we're doing is really important, because what we cultivate within this sanctuary and within the sanctuaries of our own selves affects everybody around us. In a way, we do turn it inside out. Right? We bring what we are to the world, and we meet it with all that we are, and we bring it with what we are practicing. And unless the world takes a moment to stop us on the street and tell us specifically how it was moved, well, it might just be more powerful than we will ever know. Blessed be.
I invite you to rise in body or spirit. Our closing song